Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of A New South is Rising, the podcast where we are elevating the voices of Black folks living in the rural South. My name is Sherrell Byrd, and I am so honored to welcome someone to our show today who is like my right hand in this work, in this fight. We're squad, that's what we call ourselves. And when we formed what we called squad, we had a really multifaceted group of folks. We had an attorney, a pastor, a mega community activist, and a politician, someone who rose up the ranks in politics to be able to represent us in the political sphere. And so I'm so excited to introduce my partner in this fight, Commissioner Demetrius Young. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You know, I had to have you on. I couldn't do this without you because, you know, we talk about so much, and we're going to give the people just a little sneak peek into the conversations that we have daily and all the things that we strategize around. But I know this conversation today is a big conversation that really kicked off our work here in the community, and that is utilities. And so I'm going to call this show Who Let My Good Air Out? Because, as you know, in the South, Black mamas were always fussing at us about leaving the door open wide and letting the air out. And I didn't never know what that meant. As a child, I was like, what does that mean to let your good air out? And it wasn't until I got to be an adult that I started to understand how expensive utilities are and utility bills are. And so their good air was the air conditioning that they were paying good money for. Expensive money. And it didn't dawn on me until I got to grow up and start adulting.
And paying your own bill.
Now I got to pay my own utility bill, and this utility bill is high, and I found myself saying the same thing to my children about quit letting my good air out. And so I want to lean into that a little bit because I know here in Georgia we have some of the highest energy rates in the nation. Just insane, and it's right now disproportionately impacting Black folks, even more so in the rural South. And so I want to unpack that because I know that's where we started our work, that's where we started our fight, and these last 2 years have really been peeling back the layers of this very, very complex issue. So I want to start at the top, which I think is the political side of this, and understanding here in the city of Albany, where people's bills are like $800 to $1,000 a month.
Absolutely.
We have this political, municipal organization that runs the power in our area. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship that we have and who all, I guess, has their hands into our pockets?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And, you know what we do.
That's what we do.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be explained. But just on this utility idea alone, of course, when you're talking about public utilities and corporations and different things, you know, the inside of it can be tricky. And it's a long, winding road back to the genesis of this, especially for Albany. So basically the utility goes back, probably back into the early 40s, and of course it was a way of getting, small cities then like Albany on, the electric grid, providing power for its folks. But they had to, contract with other power providers because the city is not a power provider. The city just basically resells energy to the citizens here in Albany. But in the 70s, there came a movement for cities to coalesce around getting energy so they could get quote-unquote better rates. And that had to do with what we call MEAG, or the Municipal Electric Agency of Georgia. So MEAG is a conglomeration of cities. It's a public, so they're supposed to be nonprofit, that basically partners with other utilities, corporations like Georgia Power, to help get, purchase power or produce power. We actually own part of a nuclear reactor. So Albany owns part of a nuclear reactor that produces power. We take public money, public funds, to build those nuclear reactors to provide power to Albany, other cities like Marietta, which is the top. Marietta's one. We're number two.
Number two, yeah.
And then under that, you have College Park, all the way down to small places like Camilla and Sylvester. But I think it's about, and don't quote me, but it's about 89 cities that are under this particular organization. But back in the 70s, you know, our city fathers, you know, folks like James H. Gray saw it as a way of producing other revenue for the city, so they could come down on property taxes. And that was one of the things that, you know, kind of pushes at these electric bills, is because they are looking at revenue for the city. They're not necessarily looking at anything that, you know, is supposed to be user fee based. You pay for what you use. No, we got to pay for, you know, salaries. We got to pay for police. We got to pay for all of these things. And what it kind of does is, you know, when you know you guarantee that money, because everybody's gonna pay their light bill, but you don't have a situation where people are accountable to holding a budget. You know, they say, okay, we can get that out of utilities. They're quick to do that, but the conversation never goes to, or it's a red, you know, flag. Need to talk about raising property taxes, but we'll raise utility rates, but the conversation will never go to raising property taxes. At least that's been the conversation in the city. So
can we stop for a second, because I want to unpack a lot of what you said, because you said a lot. That was a mouthful. Right. But before we do that, I got to give the rules of our show. Y'all know how we do it, Porch Fam. When we are on a New South is Rising podcast, we say a lot of shady things.
Right.
And we're going to definitely say some shady things today, because this is a utilities fight, and it is a crazy, crazy conversation. So,
well, can I say this? I can do shade, but my shade is going to actually be light.
Here's the disclaimer, y'all. That's his political disclaimer. He does represent municipalities that do impact your utilities. So we have this No Shade Lemonade. As you all know, we represent her hard on our show. This is a local black-owned business here in Albany, Georgia, with this delicious chilled lemonade sold locally in stores here in our community. So whenever we do say something shady on the New South is Rising podcast, take a little sip of No Shade Lemonade, cool us down a little bit, you know. All right. It is all good.
Even when I bring the light.
Even when you bring the light.
Okay.
So I want to go back. So you said back in 1970, this is before I was born.
Right.
These decisions about coming into this conglomerate, this non-profit. Let me sip on that, because you know,
right.
They call themselves non-profits, but they're making millions, and we know it's a way to get around taxes and all those sorts of things, so they can keep more money in their coffers. But back in 1970, we entered into this contract, and this was something that the current commission actually made this decision. So my understanding is we are locked in. And we have been locked in, and we will be locked in to this contract for how long?
Till 2050.
Till 2050, y'all. We are stuck in this contract. And it's just something that's continued with every administration. They're signing this contract and locking us into more and more years. And so I know you talked about the relationships between these utility companies. So you have Georgia Power,
or Southern Company,
which is a part of Southern Company, right? So Georgia Power is the seller of the energy.
Right.
They then resell that to MEAG. And then MEAG then resells it to Albany Utilities.
Right.
And so we're now marking that up every time, right? That's kind of
absolutely
supply and demand, right? So if you're going to make money,
well, it's not, but it's not even supply, because again, when you use your, you know, your level of utilities, it's not just that what you use. It's actually more on top of that, because the contract states that Albany has to buy a certain amount of power. Back in the 90s, when the contract was redone, we were purchasing power at a rate for a city that's 100,000 people. We don't have that many people anymore. So to make that, you know, hash out.
So we
the
still
numbers
have to make those numbers because we signed into a contract that says we will buy energy for 100,000 people, even though right now we're down to like 77.
Right. Now, I'll give, the other part of that is that the surplus energy that we don't use, sometimes based on the energy market, we can go back and resell that power. We can go back and resell that power, and it can become another source of revenue.
But we, the consumers, have already paid for it. You all get to resell it back as a municipality, but that doesn't mean that impacts my bill.
It doesn't impact your bill because they don't do rebates. They've never done rebates.
Right.
They've never put money back into the people's hands. They've always taken the money and put it to the general fund or some other fund for job creation, where the money goes back to some other business or corporate entity that, supposed to be for economic development, but it never does come back to the citizens of Albany who actually, benefit from their utility and the rates that they're paying.
And so I'm going to go back to what you said earlier about this was supposedly done to benefit the people of Albany, to help keep the commissioners from increasing property taxes.
Right.
And allowing the city to have revenue to be able to pay their staff, their personnel, and to somewhat support the general budget of the city, right? So if that is the case, if that was what it was intended for, is it a benefit today to the people for what it was intended to be?
As always, it's about how you use the money.
Okay.
If you have surplus money, which regularly every year Albany Utilities makes a surplus, they make a profit. But if that money is not being utilized for something beneficial towards the people, then I think the argument can be made that it doesn't benefit the people. It benefits the government. It benefits the salaries. It benefits the, everybody who is getting a piece of the pie from the city of Albany, as far as a check or whatever you want to call it, it benefits them. It does not benefit regular citizens. All the while their utility rates are going up. All the while we have all these issues in Albany, and, there's all this patting each other on the back. Oh, we got a balanced budget. Oh, we have surpluses in our coffers. But the city is, in turmoil in a lot of respects. So you have to talk about how you spend that money.
So let's dig into why the utility bills are so high. So we know this number one is one major issue is the way Georgia Power resells to MEAG, that resells to Albany Utilities, that resells to the average consumer.
Right.
We also know that, like you talked about earlier, that we own a nuclear reactor.
Right.
That we didn't ask to own, but we own a nuclear reactor.
That's part of it.
So we talk about this plant Vogel, because I know you just had an opportunity to go visit this huge nuclear reactor somewhere up in North Georgia. Talk about how this impacts utility rates.
Well, part of it is because, of course, with inflation, but this has actually been going on for years now. So, I think Plant Vogel, when they first started, I want to say the price tag was like $500 million or the reactor.
That was what they said it would cost to build this
when it started. Right. And this was, I think, don't get me wrong, this may have been as far back as the early 90s or whatever. But now that cost has ballooned from like $500 million to almost $6 billion. Let's wrap our minds around that. Yeah.
How do you go from $500 million to $6 billion?
Well,
and then who has to pay this over cost?
Well, it's you.
It's the customer.
It's the customers. It's taxpayers. Because again, when you have these lengthy contracts and you get locked in, and these folks, way up at the top, come up with these grand ideas, and they know they can get money from the public, based on all of these contracts, then, hey, we need the cost to be this, we need the cost to be that, and it keeps going up and up and up. And, you would